Hello crafty friends and welcome back. Today we have a very serious subject matter. We are going to be talking about how you can change your ink blending game forever. I realize that is a bold statement, but I think it is possible using some of the new products released by Heffy Doodle in January 2020, so let's jump right in. Here we have the Masquerade stencils. There are some circles and some squares. I'm hoping we get some rectangles in the future. Some of them are cut with a straight edge and some are cut with a scalloped edge. And these are really high quality stencils that are 6 by 6 inches, so they will fit either vertically or horizontally onto a standard note card. And they have these little grid marks. They're kind of hard to see on screen, but they are there to help you line this up with your card base so you can get that circle perfectly centered on your card. And I just think it's a really great product to completely change the way we ink blend, or certainly the way that I ink blend. So now, a stencil alone cannot achieve ink blending, so let's talk about some of the other tools that you might want to try to get great results with your ink blends. First of all, I have brushes. I have a couple of the different sizes from Picket Studios, and I also have this little rainbow collection from Tailored Expression that has an adorable caddy. It's almost like a craft room home decor piece, which is really nice. They look really great on your shelf, and you're unlikely to mix up the colors because the handles are colored. The Picket Fence Studio brushes, however, come in a bunch of different sizes, and that's really great for when you want to get into small spaces or just add a little bit of shading. So another brush that would be worth mentioning is the Clarity Studios stencil brushes. These are really great for adding a light wash of color. Of course, we can't forget the traditional round ink blending tool. I think everybody has these in their stash, and you can just switch out those foam toppers really easily to change colors. The final thing to talk about before we start creating is the paper that you use. A really good quality paper, or cardstock rather, is going to really help your ink blending, and I love this one. This is Bristol Smooth, and it has a super smooth surface and is nice and white, and it's going to really help you get nice smooth ink blending. Okay, let's start creating. So the first thing that I have here is one of my Masquerade stencils. This is obviously the circle with the straight line, not the scallop. And I grabbed some pixie spray, which is a stencil adhesive. And I've sprayed that on the back of the circle. And I'm using the kind of the outside piece to fit this circle into the window, so I know that the positioning is perfect on my card. I of course use the etching marks on the stencil to get it all lined up, and then we can move into ink blending. So I have sped this up slightly. My first tip for getting great ink blending would be to work slow and steady. You want very light pressure on any of the products that you're using to ink blend, and you want to work in light layers. So I'm using some Distress Oxides here in the colours Antique Linen, Squeezed Lemonade and Fossilized Amber. And I've got a mini ink blending tool with a coordinating foam circle on the top for each of the colours. Now, when working with Distress Oxide, you might get fingerprints in your ink. This is because it stays wet for a really long time and the oils from your finger may transfer, or you might pick up some of the colour, particularly if you're working with some of the really dark blues, and transfer it onto another part of your project. So I like to grab something like the Heffy Memo Tape and just stick that to my fingers, and that just gives me a nice clean surface. I can switch it out if it starts to get dirty, and it's a little easier than having to go and wash my hands and make sure they're thoroughly dry before I touch anything again. So as I'm working in these layers, I will go back in between each of the colours and blend them. You'll see many people do that, and that might not be a new tip to you, but you want to make sure that where your colours meet, you kind of switch backwards and forwards between the colours to get a really nice blend. This is of course just the first layers that I'm applying, and you'll notice that before I go direct to my card, sometimes I'll stamp off some of the excess ink, and that just makes sure that again I don't get any harsh lines that are difficult to blend out. There are two types of distress ink. There is, of course, the original, which is the distress ink, and then there's the distress oxide. The distress oxides are a little creamier and honestly easier to blend. So if you're torn between the two and you can get to have a trial of them, maybe at your local like scrapbook night, definitely give each of them a try to see which one you're a fan of. But in terms of ink blending, I do find that it is easier with the oxides. So I'm going backwards and forwards through the different colours, just layering up the ink until it's at the intensity that I like. And I know that these colours look a little weird. You're probably thinking, why have you got this kind of orangey yellow kind of mess going on? Wait till you see the stamp set I'm going to use. It will all make sense. So now I'm going to go ahead and peel off that stencil, and it's super easy to clean. You can just wipe it down like you would a normal stencil, and that pixie spray on the back will not damage it at all. And it doesn't leave any residue on your card, which is very important. So now let's move into some stamping to turn this panel into a card. Here I've got the newly released Pasta La Vista stamp set from Heffy Doodle, which is a hilarious name and an adorable stamp set. So I'm just positioning the stamps where I want them inside of that circle, and yes, you definitely could create this background using some masking paper and cutting out a circle, but having the stencil is really nice because it's reusable, it's really sturdy, so it's not going to let any ink seep through, and you can use those etching marks to make sure it is perfectly placed, which for me is a game changer. So I'm arranging two little pieces of, or one piece of pasta and a piece of cheese because I love mac and cheese, and this card is for Darren, and I felt like the sentiment works perfectly. It was his birthday, so I grabbed another two stamps from one of the other released stamp sets. These are the Roundabout sentiments, and they are all curved to fit around the stencil circle or inside of this curved banner die, which I think is really great. So getting back to our stamping, I've got everything loaded up on my MISTI now, and I'm going to use a Memento ink. This is a Copic safe ink, and I'm going to be using Copics to colour my little pasta and my cheese. So I'll go ahead and ink those up and then flip the lid of the MISTI and press that down, and this just makes sure that I get my stamping absolutely perfect. After all of that work creating the ink blending panel, it would be a tragedy if I got my stamping wrong and I messed this up. So I wanted this to be a little more intense. Another great thing about the MISTI is you can go ahead and double stamp, which will intensify your ink and also kind of fill in any of those bits that you might have missed by not adding enough pressure. So now I'm happy with my stamping. I'll go ahead and colour these pieces. I've kept this in as it's really quick. I am by no means a Copic expert, as you can probably see from my finished samples, but I get by. The colours that I used here were Y15, Y18, Y08, and also Y23. I felt like that kind of darkened the pasta shapes up and allowed it to look a little different to the cheese, but I was really happy with how this colour combination turned out, so I thought I'd include that for you. I'm just laying down my colour, starting with where I think the shadows would be, and then adding sort of my midtones and going into my light. And then similarly as how I do to my ink blending, I'll go back through that to make sure that all of those colours are blended together nicely. So now it's time to turn this into a card. I did trim down that ink blended panel just a little bit because I wanted to add a darker shade of kind of a mac and cheesy kind of colour of cardstock behind it. So I trimmed it down slightly, making sure to trim a little bit off each edge because I'd worked so hard to get that circle exactly where I wanted it, and I didn't want to trim from just one side and kind of knock that off center. So I've stuck that down to a card base, and then I'm adding just a final touch of some Nuvo drops. These are in fact the Nuvo Jewel Drops, which are semi-translucent, and they are in the orange marmalade colour. So once that was finished, that is the card totally complete, but don't worry, I have another example if you're after some more ink blending tips. So for this one, we're going to be using the square stencil, and I'm going to be using the outside piece rather than the inside. I've used those etching marks to line it up exactly where I want it, and I'm going to use some of that Heffy memo tape to tape this in place. Because I'm not using the inside piece, I've got the room to add the tape. I could also have used the pixie spray, but it's just to show you this option. So I have switched to Distress ink now, and I'm also using a blender brush. Again, I've got this sped up because you want to work really slowly and in light layers. I'm cleaning off my brush in between each of the colours just on a microfiber cloth. When the colours are pretty similar, this is sufficient to switch out your colours. You could definitely have more than one brush, which I do, but I was just showing you here that you can use just the one for multiple different colours. If you're going for like an extreme colour shift, then I would recommend cleaning the brush more thoroughly than just wiping it on a microfiber cloth, but this works just fine. So I've gone through and added the first layer. Again, I'm just pouncing off any of the excess where I need to make sure I don't get any harsh lines. This is more important, I would say, with the Distress ink because you're more likely to get those hard edges. Color combination that I'm using here is Salty Ocean, Cracked Pistachio, Shabby Shutters, and Mowed Lawn. I'm trying to get the effect of a blue sky with some green grass, but without using kind of a grass stencil over the top and just doing it as an ink blend instead. So I was finding that I wanted a little darker color at the top, so I grabbed one of the smaller brushes, and this would enable me to just blend in the middle there, so I didn't have that really big brush head kind of getting in the way of what I was trying to do, and I could just add some really small detail to my ink blending. At the tops and the bottom, I could use the larger brush and just hang it over the edge, but this really small brush is great to add tiny details as and when you need to. So I went through all of that, and then I will peel up the stencil and you'll be able to see my card base is lovely and white, just with that masked section in the middle for that square where I can build my scene. And I love the look of clean and simple cards, and I hardly ever make them, but these stencils are definitely going to change that for me. Moving into the stamping, I have another couple pieces of pasta from the Pasta La Vista stamp set, and I'm also going to be stamping down some of the accessory pieces. Because these are so small and I was going to be stamping some of them a couple of times, I switched to just using an acrylic block, and I have an ink cube here. I believe this is the Gina K Amalgam ink, which is a great ink when you don't know what type of medium you're going to be coloring with, because it works with them all. It will work with water, it will work with alcohol, it will work with Gamsol. So it's really great. It's kind of a very universal ink, and it gives you a nice dark black stamp line. So I went ahead and stamped not only the pasta, but the smiley faces and their arms and legs, which are just too stinking cute. And then I grabbed the die set and I've cut apart all of the pieces that I'm going to be using, and I've placed them over the top. Now these are tiny and it takes quite a while. It doesn't take a while, I'm exaggerating, but you take a second to make sure they're lined up and you want them to stay that way. So I'm sticking them in place using some of that Heffy memo tape. It will hold them just enough, but it will peel off really nicely when you run it through your die cut machine. So once I'm happy with the positioning of each of those, I ran it through my die cut machine and popped all of the pieces out. Because I don't want to lose anything, I'm putting all of the pieces and those tiny dies into this little tray or trinket dish on my desk so nothing kind of flies away and goes missing. There is nothing worse than losing a tiny, I mean, there is, let's be serious. But in the craft world, it pretty much sucks if you lose a tiny stamp or a die from a set that you have. Okay, now we've got over those dramatics, I'm going to put the sentiment inside of my Misty. Again, I've worked so hard on this ink blending, I don't want to mess up the sentiment at this point. If you don't have a Misty and you're worried about messing up your sentiment, you can stamp it on a strip of paper to stick on the top, or you can give it a go, and if you mess it up, just stamp it again on a strip of paper and stick it directly over the top. There is always a way to hide a mistake in card making. Now I'm going to assemble the little pasta critters. I've laid out the arms and legs where I think they need to be. They are so small that before I add any dimensional foam, I'm going to add a little squirt of glue onto the top of each of them. And then I will pick up the pasta pieces and lay them down on top and let everything stick together. So Those tiny arms and legs have got a bit of support when I start to add the foam tape, and they don't kind of get lost. I mean, there is no way I was cutting foam tape to be small enough to go behind these pieces. If you're going to do that, then more power to you, but that is far too fiddly for me. So once I had those stuck down, you can see I just covered the back in foam tape, peeled off those backing pieces, and placed them down on the card where I wanted them. So I think they look so cute, kind of frolicking in the grass in their little ink blended scene, and it's a really great, clean, and simple card. Because I don't know when to stop, I decided to add a little bit of bling by outlining that square using some Love from Lizzie peel-off strips. I'm using one of my favorites, which is the holographic. This is the gold holographic. I felt like it went nicely with kind of the yellow tones of the pasta. And I'm just laying that down around the outside of the square, and you'll notice that I'm letting the edges overlap. Now there is a reason. I've zoomed you in really close so you can see this trick. I'm pressing my craft knife at a diagonal, kind of following that corner through both pieces of the peel off. And then I'm pulling away those tiny pieces that have been snipped off. And this gives us perfectly mitered corners that just fit together so beautifully. It actually looks like there's a piece of cardstock behind there rather than peel-offs. And that's just another kind of bonus tip for if you have these peel-offs. If you don't have any of the products or you're interested in learning more about the products that I've used today, I'll try and include links to them all in the description below. Thank you so much for joining me. I hope that you're pumped up and ready to change your ink blending game forever. If you've any tips that I missed, feel free to leave them in the comments section. And if you're not already subscribed, you know what to do. Go ahead and tap the subscribe button and ring the bell if you wish to be notified whenever I post a new video. So that is all from me today. I hope to see you back here again soon. Bye for now.